Today on Matt's DIY Home Show, I'm going to show you how I built this, a 2-foot by 8-foot bump out extension for my kitchen. Sometimes I make mistakes. Shocking, I know. On and off over the last 2 years, I've put hundreds of hours of time, effort, and thousands of dollars into something that I hate. Everything that I'm going to do in this video, I think will fix the appearance of this extension, but only one thing actually will. Stay with me throughout this while we go through the whole saga of my bump out extension. Before we moved into this house, my wife sent me this inspiration picture. She loved this kitchen and thought that it solved the problem that we have. It's a problem that a lot of people in 70s houses have. The kitchens are too small. So we made a plan. Remove the kitchen and put in a 2-foot bump out so that the sink cabinet and dishwasher can slide outwards. We're also planning on moving the peninsula over to give a little bit more space. As we look at the animation of this process, when I say too small, I don't mean that you can't functionally cook in them. In fact, friends that I have from Europe think our house is massive. But as soon as you add a second person, especially someone like my father, who thinks that for some reason dishes need to be washed while the primary cooks are frantically trying to finish off Easter dinner, they're too small to avoid a divorce. No, they aren't divorced. The construction process is straightforward. Remove the floor and wall framing, sister in some joists, then frame the new wall. Now, let's look at how that actually went from a construction perspective. My wife didn't want to raise children alone while I was in jail on a murder charge after Dad came over for a Sunday supper. Here I've done all the interior tear out needed to start the process. I'm making space for the new joist through what they call a mud sill. It serves no real purpose other than making houses cold. I'm not sure that they exist anywhere else other than here. New joists are sistered 6 feet back and nailed to the existing joist to allow a 2-foot cantilever outside. Now, as plans went, this was solid. We had a vision, both of us were on the same page design-wise, and I think my execution, as you can see here, was bang on point. Since we have a cantilever outside, I could easily construct a support wall to remove the existing window header and replace it with a new one. This was by far the most nerve-wracking part of the process. No going back now. The actual construction of this addition was really straightforward and only took 2 days total to get it all completed and framed in. Once inspected, the existing floor was sheeted, the walls were insulated, drywalled, and windows were installed. Here is the outside after insulation. I should have had a bad feeling at this point, but maybe the bushes hid the problem. I then got to do the thing that I am probably the best at, making cabinets and woodworking. It's a very satisfying, fun thing for me, and a place that you can save a massive amount of money. Watch this process. Total, I spent about $3,000 Canadian on plywood, pre-made custom drawers and doors, finish, and hardware. It's a very fun, satisfying thing to do. Doing it myself allowed me to add a ton of details like these glass walnut cabinets. I love this kitchen. It turned out exactly how we envisioned. And now it's big enough that I don't need to murder my father when he comes over for Sunday dinner. Bonus. Where we aren't on point is here. This is how the outside looks. Even at this point, I'm uneasy. I don't really like how this looks, and I'm going to start trying to fix that the way that I had planned in the beginning of the project. I'm going to start adding the finishes that I'd planned because that is sure to make it look better. Past me will explain. Look at this bump out window. Hopefully we can get it sided today. I picked up some sheets of LP Smart Side panels without the grooves in it. I'll show you that in a second here. And some smart trim. What we're going to end up doing here is we'll put the panels on to provide a little bit of structure, and then we're going to frame this in a kind of craftsman style exterior. We've got some wild bushes. You can get some hate for this, but we took out the cedar that was here, which opens up the backyard and will actually allow you to see this. All right, we're finally going to get to this bump out here after quite a long hiatus due to birds and other things. So there's quite a bit of change here. It was going to be just smart trim on here, but Dad had a whole bunch of the stone left over from his stonework, so I bought some extra corners for the corners, and we're going to do some stone on here instead and do the smart trim up top. Before this, I put up some of the concrete board on here. Hopefully it'll go fairly quickly, and then we'll trim out the top with the smart trim that I have already in the garage. So, all right, so we got the blocking installed underneath, so that'll keep the first row in place. And we'll mix up some thin sets, start getting some of the stone on here. Now, I don't do a lot of planning on paper or even on computer. Most of the drawings and visualizations that I've put together for other videos are purely for your benefit. I do sketch things out sometimes, and with rentals like what I'm doing here on the interior of this project, I find an inspiration photo that can get us on the same page where it's likely to end up. But it doesn't exactly show what it's going to look like. What I'm doing here is start adding some architectural elements to this bump out to solve the fact that I didn't like it. Dad had a whole bunch of this stone left over from when I installed it in his backyard. I loved the look of it and thought that it would add a lot of interest to this exterior. He also couldn't return it because the supplier we used for it was terrible, so I could save him some money by buying it off him. If you want a more detailed look on how to install this, I did a big install of this exact stone on my parents' house in a previous video. A link to that is in the description below. The stone itself goes up pretty quickly and simply. Mix up some thin set, apply it to the back of the stone, and then stick it on the wall. I'm really banking on the stone actually making me like the exterior of this bump out. What I'm doing here is using my wet tile saw to cut the panels down to fit them between the full panels and corners. I do all of them at once, trusting myself that my measurements are correct. If you do them one by one, this process is very, very slow. Run into a problem. I need to be pretty careful not to break these. Okay, I have the 8 cut. The first cut's done on them to 17 3/4, and I have an off-cut pile because it's going to do offset pieces on the full pieces. So I'll cut those all at the same time. The goal is to get all of this cut so that after I pick up my son, I can just bang up the thin set and get these up on the wall. The wet saw is a very good way to cut these natural marble panels. In this process, I did a specific cut on all the panels that I needed before moving on to the next cut. This is a huge time saver because you don't need to constantly reset the fence with a saw. So this is where a table is better, because what you can do is you can cut to here. See on the back, I'm 3/4 the way through that. So I'll do a third cut on these. I'll get all of these cut and then we'll come back and cut the other piece. So I ended up just breaking them and peeling them back. And this was the only one that broke with a little bit here. So I'll touch up this edge and then we'll be off to the races. So I'm just doing this freehand. I'm using it like a grinder. Just a quick touch up. That's it. Okay, we're done all the cutting here, and here's where we got to. All the 17 3/4 insert pieces that'll go between the existing field pieces and the corners, they're all cut and ready. All the pieces that'll go along the edge, they're cut and ready. I'm gonna have to do some washing off once we're done here, and all of the 17-inch pieces that are gonna go between the long edge of the corners and the wall are all cut and ready as well. So this should be pretty simple. You can see I'm putting my stuff on our lovely outdoor furniture, stone dust on everything. That's the good thing about doing DIY is you can mess up your own stuff and not have to worry about it. If I was doing this at someone's house, I probably wouldn't do this. And by probably I mean I wouldn't do this. But it's my house and I get to do what I want, so. Once everything is cut, it doesn't take long to get it on the wall. I still do think the stone looks nice, but I don't think it's solving the big problem with this bump out extension. It's all done. I capped the top just with thin set the same way I do. All the pieces should be filled in. This side's a mess. It's going to need lots of work with a brush, but that's all done. You can see some of the areas here where, because I had to grind some space out, there's some odd fitting tiles. Anything big like this, I'll come back later. I have some white grout. I'll just grout those. I'm getting started on the smart trim install for the top. This should be easy and really straightforward. Remember how I said I don't do a lot of planning on paper?
Will the bush hold it?
That doesn't mean I don't plan. I can usually visualize how things are going to go and build a plan in my head. Remember me on the couch? That's how it goes normally. That's how I planned how this whole assembly would come together, and it worked very well. What I normally don't do, stylistically, is what is happening. Throwing design elements at something, hoping it turns out.
All right, so they're in and done. All flashed off at the top. And now we can start. I'm probably going to start on these sides. All right, so I took one of these 8-inch boards, I cut it down. What I'm going to do is I'm going to notch that top so it fits up to the roof. Okay, so we marked it out. Now we're going to cut out this piece here. So I don't have my tools. Instead of driving back to Mom and Dad's, I'm going to use the completely wrong tool and see if this works. Okay, I probably could have driven to my parents' place, picked up the tool that I needed, and come back, and this would have been faster. Okay, so this should fit regardless of whether it looks good or not. Okay, so what I have now is I have 2 marks, one here, one there. That's going to be the front of my 3/8 inch line. I'm going to cut this off at 3/8 inch, or where it's going to have a 3/8 inch extra reveal on the front of it, and then I'm going to take a router bit and I'm going to cut a rabbet out of it so that my 3/8 inch plywood that I'm going to put on the front here is going to be able to fasten into this front face and the edge there. Now, you're not supposed to do that with these boards. You're not supposed to rabbet them or do anything to them, but this is kind of how I have to do it, other than using solid material, which is what I probably should have done in the first place.
I'm just going to be doing all the trim out on the top of this extension. We'll get back to my design problems in a bit. I'll take you step by step through how I did this because I think it was very well executed.
Okay, so here's what we got. It's all the way out. It's 3/8 of an inch proud. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a router and cut a 3/8 inch rabbet into this. Okay, plan B, portable table saw.
The router bit that I had wouldn't work, so I just used my table saw. I'm setting the blade height and fence to do the vertical and horizontal cuts into the board in order to remove a square of material, which is called a rabbet, or if you're in the UK, a rebate. The whole purpose of doing this is to hide the edge of the plywood that will go on the front of the bump out. This is a rabbet. Now, because all this trim needs to go on 2-inch insulation, even 3.5-inch screws do not go through the trim into the sheeting behind. My solution to that was to countersink holes into the trim, which I'll plug later. This gave the screws enough bite into the sheathing and studs behind.
Here, look, it worked. And then I have a place to land the plywood. I'll take it to there. Okay, so all of this now, the entire front face is going to get 3/8 inch plywood over top of it. It'll also give me something to nail the plywood to.
There's the saying that form follows function. But let's be honest here. I think that statement shouldn't apply to house styling. I don't think that function should be abandoned, don't get me wrong, but form needs to be part of every decision. It was an integral part of the interior, but the exterior got forgotten about. This project was supposed to be finished 5 months ago, and every time I play soccer or football with the kids in the backyard, I look at this monstrosity and think, that's just bad. I've been told by multiple people something similar to, who cares, it's in a backyard and it looks fine. I'm not happy with fine, and it doesn't look fine to me.
Okay, I got some blocking built out on the bottom. That'll provide an area that if water gets down, it'll go back and through. We have the sides on. I notched out these corners. I'll just bring a full board to here, and the bottom skirt will tie into that. I put a full board at the top because that's big enough that what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim it like a box, and then the trim down the side. So now we're into the trim, which will be fast. So first are these 2 side pieces, then I'll do the bottom piece here, then I'll start doing the sides. We'll see how much of a reveal we have in the middle there, and we'll have quite a bit of a reveal up there. But hopefully it'll start to look a little bit better here pretty quickly.
Well, it doesn't look better. Don't get me wrong, I like the look of the work that I'm doing. Working with Smart Trim has made my exteriors 100% better than they were before. It's really nice to use a material that isn't warped and twisted, has nice clean edges, and allows me to do trim work like this. I'm actually pretty proud of the technical execution of this.
So it's nice up there. So we need to build a panel for the top there.
Making these end panels especially was quite satisfying and made it a quite easy install over the continuous insulation on the outside.
A really
I
small
cut
amount.
rabbets on both the
Construction
top and bottom trims, and then had a panel I could glue and brad nail together before it went up on the wall. I think it was actually a good solution in order to keep the trim all level.
Squeeze out on the back. Okay, that's like I knew what I was doing. So this was way easier than I thought it was going to be. So you don't get much better fitment than this out of the box.
We are now here. I hate this. Like, actually hate it. I've spent thousands of dollars and hundreds of hours of time to end up with something that looks, frankly, in my mind, terrible. It also has a function problem. After all the layers of exterior got added, it's too far out, which could catch water. It has a flashing over top of it, but this serves to make it both an eyesore from a form perspective and a little bit sketchy from a function perspective. Could I solve the function issue? Yes, but then we'd still be where we're at now, because if I hadn't pointed that out, most of you probably wouldn't have even noticed. The front, however, is an example where a plan in my head was cemented, executed, and I think looks good. We decided to retrim this window at the same time just to do a quick update. Needs a new window because at the time that we did the other windows, we didn't want to spend the $10,000 that this bow window cost to replace. So this is a fairly cheap upgrade to get rid of this painted plywood that's seen better days. I think it updated the front a bit and is one step closer to actually picking a color scheme for this house. See, in-head planning works when you actually do it and stick to it. So where do I go from here? I didn't have a good answer to this for a long time, which is why this sat unfinished. Sure, the white paint may tie it together color-wise, but this is more than color problems. It's form problems. What I'm doing here is cutting plugs to fill in the countersunk holes I needed to mount the trim through the foam. I then glue and hammer them into holes. Since this is rough cut looking trim, I just slice off the plugs sticking out with a chisel. I also tried a coat of paint to see if that improved it. I think it did, just not enough. I do think that I've solved the design problem, and here's how. Let's look back at how we started this whole thing. I told you my wife found this inspiration picture. I did look for similar things for the exterior until I realized that the extension was under an existing cantilever of the house, so I thought, it'll just be fine. It'll just be. Now that we've established I think it's not fine, it's time to go back to those inspiration pictures. I can tell you immediately what makes me like these, and it's this. I like how it sets it apart as a separate entity. I think that this will solve our problem here. But since I messed this up so badly, let's do a bit of work in advance to see if it does solve it. I did a few variations, one with straight roof lines and one with curves. I can tell you right now, I know I'd like the one with curves. 100% no contest. I messed around with a few variations on how far this had to come out and how high it needed to be to look good in proportion. I didn't want to be doing this again. Now, let's look at the one with the straight roof lines. Wait, why do I like this one more? Now, let's see what my wife thinks. Building this is actually very simple. It serves no function other than to look nice, like fake dormers. What you see me doing here is making up a full-size plan so that I can cut each one of the rafters. I can use this to lay out my cuts and make sure I did them right. The overall dimensions of this came from my 3D model that I did earlier. Laying a 2x4 over top, I can transfer the intersecting lines to the board. I then connect the lines, which transfers the design of the rafter to the 2x4. This is a pretty simple way to make sure that complex framing parts get made properly. This marked up board is then used to figure out what all the miter cuts will be. These all get marked onto the board as reference for when the rafter is cut. This board also needs to be done well so that it can be used as a marking template for the rest of the rafters. Now, this is what I ended up with. A quick check ensures that it still fits with the plan. If any changes need to be made, now is the time to do it. But this is looking really good. Now, this template is used to mark each rafter. As I go through the process of cutting all these rafters, let's talk about something that I mentioned in the beginning of this whole video. I am in a place that no DIYer wants to be. When I build something, I put myself into it. So when I'm unhappy with how it looks, it's really demotivating. I could have quit and just lived with it. I'm sure that over enough period of time, it would have just turned into something that's there and not something that I see. But the inside is so nice, the outside needs to match too. The last few cuts finish these rafters off. Each rafter also needed a bird's mouth that I had marked earlier but not cut, since doing that would have made the other steps harder. I just trim this out with a jigsaw and then transfer that to the other pieces and do the same. Here I am building a back truss using 2 long boards and 2 of the rafters that I had just made. After that is assembled, all the rafters will attach to it. Eventually, it is the part that will attach to the side of the house. It's clamped up and toe screws hold it together. This truss assembly and the rafters are then put together on the ground into a hip roof. That's where all 3 sides of the roof angle towards the top. Bottom cords get cut and installed, and then the rafter is toe screwed into that. That's what putting screws or nails in at this angle is called. Why? I have no idea. I guess it's mostly because you do it at the bottom of framing, but this is at the top. So, yeah. Throughout this process, I made sure things were still square so that when this went up on the house, it would be all nice and level. Now, all that's left to do is mark out the locations of the other rafters and then assemble all my pre-cut parts onto a roof. Because this is being assembled onto the ground, I'm using a sub-fascia board, which will give a bit more structure to this. I just used a 1x6 for this to keep the weight down, since I'm going to have to lift this up into the air. Now, don't ask me how I did these hip rafters, mostly eyeball and by luck. They're needed so that the plywood has something to rest on the edge. There's probably some easy math to use to make them, and I recorded lots of video of the process on how I did it, but for the life of me I couldn't figure out how to put together a coherent section of this video. So hey look, they're done. If you like what you're seeing now, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking this video. It really helps me as a small creator. I'm cutting the sheeting now because it's just easier to do it while the whole thing here is sitting on the ground, rather than standing on an 8-foot ladder. There's nothing really challenging about building this, but it was actually very satisfying. I think it looks exactly like what I thought it would look like. Once all the plywood was cut, it was taken off and the whole thing was carried to the backyard. I measured and marked the center of the window, then cut and removed the upper skirting board so that the roof would sit up against the house. I also installed some boards to help to hold this whole thing up in the air once I managed to get it there, so that it didn't drop on my head. At this point, it's time to test out my bright idea of building this thing on the ground. If this doesn't work out, I can always take it back apart and put it up on the wall, piece by piece. It's a huge relief to have this up there. I put a few screws in it off camera to make sure it stayed up there on its own and didn't fall on my head. Now, I need to mark the siding where it's going to get cut. I just used a 2-inch offset around the entire window. Once that's done, it has to come back off the wall so that the siding can get trimmed. I've only recently really got comfortable with circular saws, and it's pretty nerve-wracking doing this on an 8-foot ladder. The depth of cut is set to only go through the siding, leaving the sheeting behind it intact. Once cut, the siding can just be pulled off. Now I need to put the whole thing back up there permanently. Tons of screws into studs of the house will make sure this never comes off the wall. I can then finally put the sheeting back on. It's starting to get colder, so I really needed to get a move on. I'm not going to go into a lot of extreme details for the next part. It's a pretty simple roof. What is the most important thing to note throughout this process is to watch the bottom left-hand corners where I listed the temperatures where I was working at the time. I started this whole process when we had a very balmy plus 15 degrees Celsius. But like all things, once I actually got the planning done, it started to get cold, fast. This roofing membrane usually sticks to things by design, but it was too cold for that. You've seen me put up the drip edge and roofing membrane. The metal drip edge will help water to drip away from the wall, as well as allowing me to side aluminum fascia underneath later. None of these roofing products are really designed to go on at these temperatures. All the shingles you see me putting up are not laying flat. They don't look great now, but once it warms up again, they'll lay flat again. We don't get any extreme winds that could rip them off the roof, so they'll be fine until then. Now it's really starting to get cold, but I really want to finish this. I kept putting off work because it got cold and I thought, I'll finish this tomorrow. Then tomorrow was colder. I need to put some blocking underneath the roof to attach the soffit to. Now, for those of you who've never worked outside in cold weather, it goes like this. Everything you do takes 3 times as long or longer than it should. You actually get hot and sweating because you can never have the right amount of layers. You roast and sweat when you're active. Then, once you're sweaty, you absolutely freeze when you stop moving.
All right, this serves no other purpose other than just to capture the fascia.
All a very enjoyable experience.
We threw out some blocking. I put some blocking in the center 3. So what I'm gonna do is take a smart side panel. I'm gonna go from the center out here. I'll have to put in another piece in the middle there that'll hang off the front fascia just for support. I should get 48 inches almost to there. Same thing on the other side, then we'll have to piece in a piece here along the side. So let's get it going and see where this ends up.
I have some offcuts of the smart side panel that will make good interim soffit. Soffit is the board underneath the eaves. This one I'm going to put up as non-vented, which means that it doesn't have holes in it for air to flow through. This section of the roof has no heating below it. If it did, it would need vented soffit. Obviously, I did a bad job cutting because of my extremely substandard cutting setup. So I just used a circular saw to do an in-place trim to get it to fit. Now, why did I stop for the day? Dad life. Would it have been better to continue and get it done when it wasn't -30 with the wind chill? Yes. Yes, it would have. 2 more pieces and it wraps up the soffit. Notice how I moved inside and switched to my track saw? Even I have a point where being outside is abusive. Let's get these installed before I freeze myself into the landscape permanently. I know you won't believe it, but there is a crossover with cold. It feels much nicer here at -30 than it did yesterday at -18. Weird, right? Maybe I'm just lying to myself to keep going. Probably that. I'm not sure what the soffit color will be, so it'll just get left in primer for right now. Not that you can paint in -30. The last thing to cap it off is the fascia. It just slides up behind the drip edge. Now, should I step back and see what this actually looks like? Does the in-person look as good as the rendering? There are definite angles that things look better at on the computer, and often you don't get to look at it from there in real life. I'm happy. This is exactly what I wanted. Let me know in the comments if you've made it this far, and if you think this whole extra step was worth it. I'm interested to see what you think. Although there are a few design things that I could have improved on, even in this part of the build, it finally is all together. And I like it. Not love, but that may come with time. I guess I don't have to love everything about my DIYs, just like it. Thanks for watching. See you next time.